Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the wedding feast of Cana and the cleansing of the temple as described in John chapter 2 in our continuing survey of the life of Christ. John chapter 2 verse 1 says, "On the third day there was a wedding." Now we have to stop there mid-sentence because when you say there's a third day, that's taking us back to 3 days earlier first. It's part of a time sequence. And we saw a time sequence going back to chapter 1 where there were 4 days in the life of, well, I guess we could call it the early ministry of Jesus. Jesus wasn't even mentioned except remotely in chapter 1 verses 19 through 28. That's when a delegation comes to John the Baptist and says, "Who are you? Why are you saying these things?" And John says, "No, I'm not the one. I'm not the promised Messiah. I'm not the one that Moses promised. I'm not any of those things. I'm just one who is the forerunner." And then on the second day, he introduces Jesus, says, "This is the one of whom I spoke," speaks about his baptism and tells the account of what had previously happened. The third day, he's there with 2 of his disciples, and he sees Jesus, and he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God." And 2 of John's disciples start following Jesus. And one of them goes and gets his own brother, as Andrew gets his own brother Simon, and who is going to be given the nickname Peter. And so these 2 disciples of John plus Peter begin following Jesus. And then on the 4th day, you have Philip and Nathanael. They each meet Jesus. Philip meets Jesus and starts following him, and he goes and tells Nathanael about Jesus. And Nathanael isn't so sure at first, but he eventually comes along. And so they meet Jesus. And now 3 days later, on the 3rd day, but it's the 3rd day after the 4th day, we're going to have this wedding feast of Cana, where Jesus and his disciples attend the wedding, and Jesus is going to perform his first miracle. So, the wedding and the wine. And on the 3rd day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. It's up in the Galilean region. It's not right on Cana is not right on the Sea of Galilee. It's inland and uphill from the Sea of Galilee. And the mother of Jesus was there, and Jesus was also invited, and his disciples, to the wedding. Now, I don't know if this had been part of the plan or if he had had a long-standing invitation, but he's invited to the wedding. And when the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." This was considered a shameful thing, and this was an honor and shame culture. So this is a big deal. They have no wine, and is she telling Jesus because he can go to 7-Eleven and pick up some more, or I'm not sure what she expects, because there's evidence that she had known there was something special about her son. But has she put it all together in her mind? I don't know yet. Verse 4, "And Jesus said to her, 'Woman, what have I to do with you?'" Now that's a very cryptic way of speaking. I have never said to my own mother, "Woman, what have I to do with you?" I think she would be shocked, and rightfully so, because that doesn't translate very well into English. But remember when Jesus is on the cross and he says to her, "Woman, behold your son," as if to point her attention to the beloved disciple who's now going to take care of her. And then he says to the beloved disciple, "Son, behold your mother." So that was done, I think we can say it was in a spirit of tenderness. Maybe this is not quite so harsh as it might initially sound. At the same time, "Woman, what have I to do with you? What is this between you and me?" And then he takes that one step further. "My hour has not yet come." Now, that's going to, when he speaks about his hour coming, that's going to be speaking about his hour to go to the cross. And he's referencing that now, that hour of his departure. Maybe she was hinting we had to leave the wedding feast. Not sure what's in her mind. But he says, "My hour has not yet come." And so he's referencing it with the cross in mind. And his mother said to the servants, whatever he says to you, do it. She's going to just trust her son to do whatever has to be done. Now, there were 6 stone water pots set there for the Jewish custom of purification, containing 20 or 30 gallons each. These are big pots. These are huge, aquarium sized. And they were there because this was a Jewish household, and because purification rituals were necessary to the Jews. Before you would eat, before you would touch something, you had to go through not just washing your hands, but it was a ceremonial purity, where you would wash them in the right way, where water would be poured upon them, and then once it was poured, that water that now comes off your hands is now unclean. So you had to have plenty of water around. And Jesus said to them, fill the water pots with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And so here's these water pots, stone water pots, because other kinds of water pots could get ceremonially unclean, but stone doesn't get unclean, at least ceremonially wise. And they filled them up to the brim. And here they are, they're taking these water pots, and now Jesus gives them some instructions that must have shocked these servants. He said to them, draw out some now, and take it to the head waiter. I'm not sure what he's going to do with it, but they took it to him. And when the head waiter had tasted the water, you can imagine him saying, that's not for washing, that's for washing your hands. Now, it doesn't mean it would be soapy water or dirty dishwater. It's not like that. It was ceremonially pure, which meant it was probably in pretty good condition. But you didn't drink the water as a rule. You always, especially at a wedding feast. And when the head waiter tasted the water, which had become wine, somewhere in the process, the water had been turned to wine. But the head waiter doesn't know that. And he didn't know where it had come from. But the servants who had drawn the water knew. So the only ones, here a miracle is taking place, the only ones who know that the miracle is taking place, there's Jesus who performed the wedding, or the miracle, and there are these servants. And they get to see that a miracle is taking place, and they knew where the water came from. And the head waiter called the bridegroom and said to him, you've sort of broken the mold here. Every man serves the good wine first, and then when men have drunk freely, when they're not quite worried about it, then that which is poor. You have kept the really great wine till now. So here Jesus turns to water to wine. He doesn't just turn water to wine. He turns water to wine that tastes great. And this beginning of his signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory. And here's the result. And his disciples believed in him. Somewhere along the line, the disciples become aware of what's taken place. And this becomes something that will help their faith to grow. And we're told the story so that it will help our faith to grow as well. Well, that's the first story here. Next we go to a second narrative. The second narrative is going to have Jesus coming to the temple. Now, John's account is unique among the 4 gospel accounts in that John tells of Jesus going a number of times to Jerusalem and a number of times to the temple. Matthew, Mark, and Luke only describe a single instance, and they only describe it at the end of the ministry of Jesus. So after this, he went down to Capernaum. He and his mother and his brothers and his disciples, they stayed there a few days. They go down to Capernaum by the Sea of Galilee. Here we go. Cana, Nazareth, Sea of Galilee. They go down to Capernaum. They stay there for a bit here on the Sea of Galilee. And this is later going to be the center of the ministry of Jesus. This area by the Sea of Galilee, 500-600 feet below sea level. But Passover, the Passover of the Jews, was at hand. And Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So even though he goes down to Capernaum, and that's eventually going to be his base of operations, I'm not sure if that's taken place yet. He goes up to Jerusalem. Now, the Synoptic Gospels tell, as we noted, that Jesus and his disciples come to cleanse the temple, but they tell the story at the end of the ministry of Jesus. Gospel of John puts it right here. And the question is, did it happen twice? Or are the Synoptics and the Gospel of John telling the same story with different details and placing it in a different place in the narrative? The Synoptics have Jesus and the disciples cleansing the temple. John only mentions Jesus cleansing the temple. The Synoptics place this at the end of the ministry of Jesus. Here in the Gospel of John, we see it at the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. The Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, do not mention him making a whip of a scourge. The Gospel of John tells us that Jesus fashioned a scourge of cords, and uses this to whip people from the temple. The Synoptics make no mention of the zeal of Jesus. Now, he's obviously zealous, but the Gospel of John have the disciples remembering a prophecy of the Messiah's zeal for the house of the Lord. And so there are a few, I think, minor features which are distinct. But did it happen once or did it happen twice? I used to think that maybe it happened twice, and I did this for a good reason. Because there are some events that sometimes do take place twice. For example, at the beginning and at the end of both the life and the ministry of Jesus, we read about him coming to Jesus for the Passover. Remember in Luke chapter 3, we see him as he's 12 years old. And he comes to Jerusalem for the Passover. Here in John chapter 2, he's coming to Jerusalem for the Passover at the cleansing of the temple. And yet, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John will also speak of him coming again to Jerusalem for the Passover at the end of the life of Jesus. He cleanses the temple, and I'm going to put a question mark. Was this once? Was this twice? Was this at the beginning? Was it at the end? Let's table that for a second. At the beginning and at the end of the ministry of Jesus, we have him serving wine. John chapter 2, he comes to Cana, at the wedding feast at Cana. He serves wine. And at the Last Supper, just before his arrest and trials and death, burial, and resurrection, he will be at the Last Supper and he will say, "This is my blood, which is shed for you." He will serve them wine. At the beginning and at the end of the life and ministry of Jesus, we have two different Simons. Remember a Simon that Luke describes? When Jesus is born and being presented in the temple. And then a Simon of Cyrene, who helps with the cross of Jesus. There are Marys. There's a Mary in the beginning story, his mother. And even though she's there at the end, the Mary that takes front and center stage at the end, especially here in the Gospel of John, is going to be Mary Magdalene. Same name, two different women. There's a Herod at the beginning of the life of Jesus, Herod the Great. There's a Herod at the end, a different Herod, the son of Herod the Great, Herod Antipas. There's a Joseph at the beginning of the story of Jesus, Joseph, the adopted father of Jesus. And there's a Joseph of Arimathea in the end of the story of Jesus, who gives his newly cut tomb for Jesus in which to be buried. So sometimes there are some similarities. That doesn't make them the same people. It doesn't make them the same events. But in this case, I think it very possibly is the same event. And that's okay. You say, well, did it happen at the beginning of the ministry of Jesus or at the end? I'm not entirely sure. But this is similar. I'm going to borrow someone else's illustration. I didn't make this one up, because I'm not a sports fan, but I understand when you read, for example, a sports article in the newspaper, and it might say that the score between the Boston Celtics, I'm not even sure where the Celtics are from, so I'm just making up these names, excuse me, and another team. The score was such and such, and then it might mention one of the key plays, and then it goes back to tell the rest of the story. which means that it's giving the story in chronological terms rather than, it's giving the story in topical terms rather than in chronological terms. And we hear it that way, and we don't bat an eyelash because we expect it. It's part of our culture. We're used to it. And the same thing, it's very possible that the same thing happens here. And that's okay. Because oftentimes we have events, the same events, which are arranged topically instead of chronologically. In the case of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they are only going to talk about things that happened in Jerusalem at the end of the story, because they don't want to talk about all the different trips Jesus made to Jerusalem. So they just put all those at the end of the story. It's a geographical arrangement instead of a chronological arrangement. It's possible that's what takes place here. Maybe. Well, in any case, Jesus comes to the temple, and he found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves and the money changers seated. Now, when you went to the temple, and this is a view from from south of the Temple Mount, looking upward toward the Temple Mount, you have all of these steps, and I guess we would think, I look at them and think balconies, but you go up to the Temple Mount because the Temple Mount's a mountain, and you have to get up there, and so you would go up, and there would be this, today it's all ruins, but in that day it would have been a marvelous palisade of structures and steps and baths leading up to 3 gates, the Huldah gates. There were 3 on the right, and as far as I can tell, 2 on the left. We look at this model. Now, the model hasn't got it quite right. A model showing what it would have looked like in Jesus' day. You went up through the Huldah gates, and you came out on the other side. You came out on the other side, and you would see the temple. And you would be in a portion of the temple compound known as the Court of the Gentiles. In the south end of that, you would have what was known as Solomon's Porch. You see the big colonnades and the columns. And then this big wide open space. And this had become the place where it was now customary to conduct the buying and selling of those things which were appropriate to the use of the temple. The problem is that it had become big business. And it had become sort of a business as usual instead of being a holy place. And Jesus found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves and the money changers seated. And he made a scourge of cords and drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who were selling the doves, he said, "Take these things away. Stop making my Father's house a house of merchandise." Stop what you're doing. This is to be a holy place. And his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for thy house will consume me." After all, when Jesus is finally arrested, one of the charges against him will be dealing with his actions in the temple. And they remember how there was a prophecy and how Jesus fulfilled these words. Well, the Jews therefore asked and said to him, "What sign do you show us, seeing that you do these things?" Now, they don't ask him, "Gee, the temple was okay." No, they don't say that. I think they sort of get there was something wrong with the way things were set up. But what sign do you show us, saying that you do these things? A sign points to authority. So that's just a different way of saying, who gave you the authority to do this sort of thing? And Jesus answered and said to them, they asked for a sign, here's the sign, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Now they say, wait a minute. You and what construction crew? The Jews therefore said, it took 46 years to build this temple. By the way, it wasn't finished yet. 46 years and counting. And will you raise it up in 3 days? Who do you think you are? Verse 21, but he was speaking of the temple of his body. I'm so glad that John, the author of this gospel account, adds those words. Because if he hadn't, then there would be those who would be saying, gee, the temple in Jerusalem got destroyed, and sometime when Jesus comes back, or before he comes back, or at some point, he's going to raise it up, and it'll be raised up prefab in 3 days. And that's not what this prophecy is describing. It is not speaking of a future literal rebuilt temple. It is speaking of Jesus and his death and burial and resurrection. He is the temple who died, who was brought down, who was buried, and who in 3 days was raised again. The temple. He is the temple. Now think about what a temple does. A temple is a place where you go to meet God. A temple is the place where God resides. And that's what Jesus is. He is the one who was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he is the one who became flesh. And the glory of God dwelled with him, tabernacled with him. He did what a temple was supposed to do. He housed God. You look at Jesus, you look at that body, and that was God. Not the body, the person within it. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had spoken. Notice that continuing refrain. We saw the miracle of the water to wine, and the disciples saw it, and they believed. Here, again, when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered, and they believed. And the point is that John wants you to believe too. Hear it and believe that this is the one that God has sent, for in whom you can believe.